quite a big distance to be here at this inquiry today, and on behalf of the committee, I thank you for that. For the Hansard record, could you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear?
Warren King, Chief Executive Officer, DMO.
And Colin Thorne, General Manager, Land and Maritime, reporting to the CEO of DMO.
Fantastic. Thank you for appearing before the committee today. As I noted earlier, this is part of a larger inquiry that the Senate's going to be inquiring into the future of the Australian shipbuilding industry. This is obviously a smaller part of that inquiry, which is more specifically looking at the issue of the tender process around the procurement of supply, the supply ships. So we may at some point, as we prepare for the larger report, which will be 1st of July next year, ask you to return at some point. And again, I note that you've always made yourself and your organisation incredibly available to Senate inquiries and Senate hearings. I want to invite you to make a brief opening statement, should you wish to do so.
Senator, I haven't prepared one because of short notice and changing some plans, but if I could start with my own personal reflections. I've been involved in this business for over 40 years, particularly in naval business, and there's nothing that I personally would prefer to see in this country than a vibrant and effective shipbuilding industry. So as we work through today, I'm very pleased to be here because there's a lot of misunderstanding about how you might get to that place. So I'm very pleased that you invited me, and I'll be very pleased to answer the questions, and if I can, to try and shed more information that the committee can use to form its own opinions.
Okay. Before we get into specific questions that I know a lot of the senators have, and we do have a bit of time with you today, Mr. King, do you want us to just take one step back and explain to us the process of how we came to the decision that was made, and then others can ask questions about that process. But if you can just briefly outline just on a kind of factual basis, the series of events that led to the decision that was made.
There's a number of events that come together, just if you could just bear with me, because I think for the committee's sake you need to see these as a whole. There is a need in Australia for at least 3 programs to be underway relatively quickly, and I'll come back to the urgency of those. The Future Frigate Program, the AORs that you're interested in today, and Pacific Patrol Boats. Of most urgent in those, the number 1 priority is the AOR replacement for the Navy. Success is an older ship, and in fact its life of type expires in 2016. And we're spending a considerable amount of money to keep an old ship afloat. As you probably understand, that they call in reliability a bathtub effect, a bathtub curve. So when you buy something, you have early failures, then you use it for a large number of years, pretty efficiently, limited maintenance. Towards the end of its life, as things become very old, and in fact often not even replaceable, in terms of our ships, they can be 35 years old. So, you know, imagining getting a pump 35 years old. Well, success is well and truly into that part of its life. So the reason you have an AOR and a detailed analysis of operational requirements is better handled by Navy, but clearly with my background I can explain that, is these are replenishment ships. So central to them is replenishing fuel at sea to operations at sea, but also is replenishment of food, commodities and ammunition. So they're a very large ship and a relatively complex in terms of what they carry. They are not complex in terms of weapon systems, missile systems and things like that. So actually there were 3 decisions made concurrently. One was to proceed with the procurement of a replacement AOR with a limited tender. The other was to, and this is very important from my personal perspective, the government decision clearly, is a decision to look at continuation of the feasibility of a replacement frigate program, continuing on from the air warfare destroyer, effectively using that current hull, but with different equipment, and I've prepared some material which I can show you why that might make sense. And then the third decision was for an open tender to Australia to supply Pacific patrol boats. So I think it's important to realise that there were 3 decisions made that related to acquisition of ships' maritime equipment, each with a different focus. Perhaps I could just clarify that question that came up about CPRs and the exemptions.
I'm sure there'll be lots of questions on that, yeah.
My sort of simple interpretation of that is the CPRs as required require us to not discriminate for a procurement. Over $80,000, we have to go to the open market, literally the open market.
So is that over 80 or over $10,000?
$80,000, I believe it is.
For you guys, okay.
So what it requires is for any, and this has come up in other forums, it's come up as, you know, matters of when we acquire military clothing, for example. So if the procurement is more than that, we have to go to the open market. The other option you have is going to a limited tender. Now, limited doesn't mean limited to Australia or limited. It just simply means that you put limitations on the tender. And there are 2 reasons that are predetermined that, and I am the executive that performed that opinion within DMO and then within the department, that the exemption could apply and should apply to these ships, which is an exemption simply to go to a limited tender. Now, that doesn't mean a limited tender to overseas or it just means a limited tender. Now, sometimes I've used that exemption to be a limited tender for Australia. And so, for example, just coming back to the point I made, although it's not yet at a tender stage, there will be tendered work. The work to be done to see if we can build a future frigate in Australia will rely on that exemption. I will have to exercise that exemption to say, if the government so chooses, that the only place we're going to build the future frigate is in Australia. Otherwise, I would have to go to the world market and see who wanted to supply us a frigate.
You've done the opposite here, though, haven't you, Mr. King?
Yes, that's true, Senator, and I'm happy to explain why.
Well, I mean, Mr. King, I mean, that is the question. I mean, so just before we get to the question, just to quickly understand the process, and then we can get to the specific question about why. The process decision, and we'll get to the question, obviously. So a decision was made, and we'll go through the reasons about why the decision was made, and there'll be lots of questions around that. You formed the view that it should be a limited tender, but is that your decision or the Minister's decision?
Within DMO, it obviously becomes a departmental submission, and then it becomes a government decision. But within the DMO, I formed the opinion, and I'm responsible for that it should be a limited tender.
So you approached the government and said we should do this as a limited tender?
Well, no, the department formulates advice for the ministers, and ministers then take it to the government. But our advice to the minister was that this should be pursued by a limited tender.
And then you took that to finance, or no, they took that to finance?
Well, central agencies...
What's the liaison between you and finance?
Central agencies review all cabinet submissions, so I can't say how they handle it inside finance. But clearly under the rules, I'm the responsible officer for forming that opinion. Now, it could be rejected by finance or others, but I'm saying I take accountability for forming that opinion.
And you're saying you made that decision independent of finance and the minister? You came to that decision within DMO, outside of...
I'm not a career public servant, but my simple understanding of my role is to give the best advice I can to the minister and the government, and that they form their opinions. And I gave, in this case, what I think is my best advice. And I'm happy to explain why I gave that advice.
Perhaps you should then. So if we understand the process now, if you give us your explanation of the decision. So I'll make the question more specific. The decision is this. Why, in this set of circumstances, was there a request made to use the exemption of 2.6 under the Commonwealth procurement rules, in particular around the area, and the reason that was given to finance was for the protection of essential security interests. How did this tender meet that requirement?
Well, it's not at tender, but that's the decision to
Yes.
go to that tender. Yeah, it's agreed. If I can come back to the central elements that drive me. The first is, and foremost is, and whether this is in the area of combat clothing or ships or aircraft, is to give the very best possible equipment to the ADF that we can for the budget we have, not just purely on buying today, but the long-term consequences of such an approach. So a very balanced approach. I just want to anchor it in. We often get this belief, and I'm a fiercely proud Australian, that the only reason Australian companies don't win defence tenders and stuff is because they're not the cheapest. It's not always the case. They're not always the best. And remember, I am, in this same series of decisions, was a decision to pursue the feasibility of building future frigates in Australia, which I believe is critical to having a vibrant and effective shipbuilding industry. Now, back to the AOR. What's different? For a ship, and I have prepared some charts, so I might, if you don't mind, I can table them as well, but it's easier for me to sit here and talk to them. For a shipbuilding industry to be effective and efficient, you effectively need productivity efficiency. And productivity efficiency comes through really three main areas. First of all, let me just separate what doesn't change it. What doesn't change it a lot is the material costs. So, for example, if you're going to buy a gas turbine or a diesel engine for this ship, we can buy it pretty much as effectively in Australia as an overseas supplier can buy it. There's probably some shipbuilders that have a better buying power than we would, but basically it comes down to that doesn't discriminate too much, cost of steel, cost of other things. What really drives up the costs of shipping, producing a ship, is productivity. And again, that doesn't come down to the ability of a welder to weld a metre of weld. We are probably as good as that as anybody in the world. So it's not down to the individual. It's back to the organisations and structures around it. Now, the first way to get efficiency is what they call module building and pre-outfitting. So this is a practice all around the world. So what you try and do is you take a slice of the ship called a module and you pre-outfit it with as much equipment as you can. This gives you access to both sides of the module, so you can fit it out. And what the world benchmark you're looking for is about 85% pre-fit out or better. Now, clearly then, the module size is set by the beam of the ship, pretty much. I mean, you could slip it again. But by having the module size, the bigger the ship gets, the bigger the module gets. And the second thing you want to do is you want to be able to turn the modules, invert them. Because the last thing you want to do is to have welders doing a lot of fitting out work over the top of the head, or electricians overhead. So what we do is we build the modules and then we turn them over so that the workers can work downhand, not overhead. Now that's all very well established practice from around the world. Now, if you look at, say, the AWD, it's in the order of 18 metre beam, I think 18.3 metre beam. Can I have that chart of the LHD and AWD comparator, please? Maybe bring them all down here, Russ, so I can grab them. Whereas the LHD, for example, is 32 metres, and these AORs are likely to be 23 metres. Now, this is actually an LHD AWD comparator, but it gives you a sense of the scale of the ship. I've tried to get a beam one as well, but you've got a beam of 32 metres on the LHD, 23 metres on this AOR, and only 18 metres on the AWD. So to build that module, you now need, so the module tends to end up now well over 300 tonnes, which is big. And just to remember, the LHD, we did what we call a hybrid build. So none of the major modules were built in Australia. Two modules up here were built in Australia. That was split into 2 modules. But the rest of the major construction work for the LHD was done in Spain. So we have pretty much an infrastructure in Australia that can handle up to about that 18 metre, 20 metre module, and the weight that comes with it obviously goes up very much. And some modules in some really efficient yards can go up to 900 tonnes. Now, to have that, you need 3 things. You need the lift and a docking facility to take the big modules. You need the halls that are big enough, and obviously, you know, the span you need to handle a module that wide is quite significant. And then you need the craneage that can rotate the modules and then put them in place when they're finally brought together. So that's really one of the key drivers to how you're going to get a productive module building and shipbuilding organisation. The second thing that's very difficult is the design. So what a lot of people would not realise is that each shipyard has to go around building a design a different way. You can imagine this in a sort of car plant where you have robots set up to, you know, to build a certain car. What's also very important in these designs is because you want to bring these modules together, you've actually got to design your module in your construction technique against the way you're going to build it. So just because the design exists and that ship exists, been built before, for example, if you're going to build it in a new shipyard that's never built it before, you may have to what they call reproduction engineer that whole ship in order to be able to build that ship in that new facility, which has different spaces, different sheds.
But that applies to building anything, anytime.
Sorry?
That applies to any kind of building, be it a car, be it a,
right,
be it a
but
gadget,
of course here
be it a
we're
widget.
talking about super size structures.
Okay, so that's the second thing, and the third thing's...
Third thing is you need to do it lots of times. You need to do it lots of times. 1-offs and 2-offs do not make for anywhere near efficient shipbuilding, and I can show you an example from reality without even theory here, which is from our Anzac ship project. Now, Anzac ship project in Australia was probably the benchmark of economic performance in shipbuilding in Australia.
Yep.
The black line is the learning curve you would normally anticipate, and that's depending on a 10% efficiency or an 8% learning curve effect. In fact, with Anzac, the first few, we didn't get that learning curve effect, and talk about that later. But I think it was about ship 6 or 7, we were well down at international benchmarks. And in fact, by the end of that program, we were building those ships in Australia cheaper than we could have bought them offshore. So the main thing here, labour rate is not such a big factor. In fact, there is no structural reason that Australia can't be an efficient shipbuilder. But in my opinion, it can't even be close to efficient shipbuilder unless you have a genuine strategic approach to how you're going to build these ships and which ships you're going to build. And simply doing 1-off or 2-off ships, particularly if they're very large, require a very high investment in infrastructure, which is unlikely to ever be used again. So our demand for another big ship is probably 30 years away. Would be a highly questionable fishing. Now, I can also go into the impacts on schedule and cost from the work we've done.
Well, I mean, I know there's quite a few other questions, but the broader question, and this is the bit that I guess hasn't quite been answered here. I appreciate, and I mean, the example you use about the reduction of cost the more you produce. I mean, I understand that's, in my limited understanding, that's why the latest air warfare destroyer costs so much less than the earlier models. As you kind of get better at building these things, you build them quicker and cheaper. I mean, that goes without saying. But the bit that I don't quite understand in all of this is, and if you explain more specifically now, if you have everything you're saying is fine, but wouldn't that all come out in a tender process? So if an Australian explain this to me. So everything you're saying, a tender process is designed to expose all of this. So if I'm tendering and using hypothetical, I'm company A, and I, based on your belief, effectively can't do it well and can't do it at the right cost because I don't have the economies of scale that, say, a plant somewhere else in the world, in this spirit we're talking about Korea and Spain, but wherever, has the ability that they have to build it. Wouldn't you have been better off not using exemption 2.6, going to a tender process? And if the Australian firms aren't able to do what you're saying, then that's the whole point of the tender process. Because if there's one set of claims they can, and there's one set of claims they can't, isn't that the entire point of the tender process, so that we can expose all this?
Yeah, very, very true. But I also get told very regularly and very fairly, why are you driving companies to tender for stuff you're never going to award them? You know, in other words, I've got to be mindful of practical. Can I just go back to this exemption? But
if they can meet the tender, why wouldn't you award it to them?
Yeah, but I'll come back to answer your question, but okay. I just want to clarify this exemption a bit. Say, for example, we had said, we want to build this ship and only Australian companies can tender for it, say, we still would have had to use the exemption.
Of course you would.
Yep. You know, just to be clear. Yep. That exemption had to apply if we in any way limited the tender. Whether if we, you know, yep. Theoretically, we could put that tender out and an airplane manufacturer could tender, you know what I'm saying about. So whenever I limit the tender in any way, shape or form, whether it's from country of supply, type of supply, I have to use the exemption that was used in this case. Now, what went through my mind, and I'm happy to work through it, there's three ways, the AOR, and I'm happy to establish the urgency for it, but if you'd like some more data on that, my point being that these ships need to be replaced. The quickest replacement time that we think is even remotely possible is about 3.5 years build time, you know, that sort of order. So we need to get into contract soon. Not only are these needed for military capability, but every year that ship success, being the first ship needing replacement, every year that ship is not replaced is an increased maintenance cost that's likely to accelerate. It is beyond its design life in 2016. Even at the moment, we're offering 2017. So that's the principle behind it. Now, what three options could we have? So you could have an offshore build, which is where we're going. I'll come back to that. You could have a complete onshore build, or the committee might be, you know, thought about, well, a hybrid build like we had with the LHD, which was the bulk of the ship produced in Spain and elements of it fitted out in Australia.
I mean, so I'm saying, couldn't you have done a fourth thing, which is effectively to determine that, just turned around and said, look, these are, appreciating the fact there's a 3.5 year time frame and that you need this, couldn't you have just put that in the tender document in terms of the tender, as part of the tender process, and just let them compete, and whichever of those three made the most economic and security sense, gone with them? That's the bit I kind of. Yeah. I'm not disagreeing with. No. You're effectively justifying why you would probably make a decision. That's fine, but why would you preempt any of that?
Well, normally because industry say to me on those cases when they tendered, you knew we couldn't meet that, and we put to this cost. Can I just run through?
Yeah, sure.
No, even in informal discussions, just to be clear, no company has suggested to me or to my organisation that this ship should be built in Australia.
So no Australian company has said that they should be part of a partnership or any kind of play any role in this?
No, partnership is different. I'm just coming back to the complete ship should be built in Australia.
Okay.
Now, you might say the past is the past.
I just want to have just some understanding. How much does it cost industry to tender?
Well, tenders like this can. I mean, it depends. It can be $5-6 million. I mean, you know.
But they don't have to tender. They choose to tender.
Sorry?
They choose to tender, it's their decision, right?
Yeah, but I'm just...
Yeah, that's true, but there's a complexity. I'd like to come back to the complexity. All of that would be true and simple if there was tens of these designs laying around the world and tens of companies in Australia that can compete for it. But what we're in is a very fine world market with very few designs that can meet the needs. I mean, the world is just, the accessible market is not just full of designs that you can access. So, so the problem would come about that, first of all, if you're going to do a complete onshore build, let me just say, the last time we did a complete onshore build of a ship of this size took 11.5 years, and in fact it was success, took 11.5 years and was 4 times over budget. Instead of buying 2 ships, we bought 1. Now, one might argue that we've learned a little bit. I could argue that in some places we have and in some places we haven't.
That was the 1970s though, wasn't it, Mr. King?
Yes, but...
Sure, no, I'm just saying.
It's got worse though, hasn't it, since then?
Well, shipbuilding in this country since Federation has been a stop-start proposition. It's never had a proper strategic approach to military shipbuilding. I believe there is a need to, and I believe there is an opportunity, and the decisions that have been made recently, I think, provide that opportunity, although we and industry will have to lift our performance. So, and some of the reasons that go, you have to first of all, just getting into an arrangement to bid that job, coming back to you, Chair, is the Australian company would have to team with the design owner. Okay. If you even look at the submission from the Royal Institute of Naval Architects, they make exactly that point, that you would have to go to a designer. Now that designer, in all instances I can think of, is also a shipbuilder. So here you are in Australia saying, it's an open competition, it's an open tender, I want to tender your design, and this designer is also a shipbuilder wanting to tender that build of it. And remember what I sort of, or please reflect back what I said at the beginning. That design will have to be re-engineered in order to be built in the facilities that it will exist in Australia.
Now, Missy, I know there's quite a few other questions, so just before I move on to answer, just the point, just the final point, and then we'll go straight to Senator Carr. That's all, I'm not disputing any of that. I just don't understand, and I don't quite got qualification, is none of that changes the fact that everything you're saying could have been determined in an open tender. So if I'm a supply builder from, say, country X, and I have the design, and I can build it, and it's cheaper for me to build it, or better, and I have a better proposal, and then I believe partnering with Australian firms is effectively going to set me backwards, then I don't have to partner with them. I don't quite understand how everything you're saying couldn't have been achieved or exposed, if it's well, true or not, in a transparent manner.
Possibly could have, but at cost to industry, which would have been ineffective. If I can just make another point. If we tender for an offshore supplier, it typically takes, and this is from experience, 2 years. If it's a hybrid bid, it's 3 years. And if it's an onshore build, it's 4 years, because the reason is that you have to bring, just come back to that point, you have to get the designer. For example, I see the South Australian government's made a submission about the facilities they could increase. So in order for that Australian company to effectively make a bid, it would have to team with the designer that was prepared to do, you know, under reasonable terms to release that design. It would have to do a lot of work with another government or another backing to come up with maybe $200 million worth of infrastructure. It then has to put its bid together. So even if we said, I'm trying to get this ship in service by 2017, you know, very, very challenging, but as soon as we can, that would at least add, in my opinion, 2 years to the tender process, to be fair to them. I mean, there's not much point me putting out a tender that's not fair. If I was to put out a tender and say, you must have this solution to me in 2 years, they wouldn't be able to do it.
Well, thank you. Mr King, this is not a project that came about on the 1st of April this year. is it not? Is that the case?
That's correct.
How long have you been considering the replacement of these supply vessels?
Well, Senator, you know, in various forms for years. Yeah.
For years.
Yeah.
And the previous government had a policy to build these vessels, or a preference to build these vessels in Australia, did it not?
I believe that was the case.
And you would have done work on that proposal.
We didn't get to first pass.
No, but you would have done work on that proposal.
Not a lot, Senator, because it didn't progress that far.
So the question of the hybrid build was, you're quite right, no one is asking to build these vessels entirely onshore. But we've had submissions here from a number of companies, BAE, South Australians, suggesting that the hybrid capability was to build the vessel here on a hybrid model was in fact viable. Do you agree?
Yes, it's viable, yes.
But you've said that you've made a recommendation, and that's all it was, because the government's got to make decisions. It's not the DMO's job to make the decision. You make a recommendation to government that we didn't have the capability here.
No, I didn't say that.
Sorry?
No, I didn't say we didn't have the capability here.
You said we didn't. Well, then
I made a recommendation.
Do acknowledge we do have the capability here?
Well, you can just to go back, you can always have the capability. It's whether it's a feasible course of action.
So there's two issues here. There's the question of capability, and there appears to be an argument about whether or not we have a capability. There's then the question of time. And as I understood your argument, we do have the capability here, we don't have the time.
Well, can we be clear, are we talking about a hybrid build?
Hybrid model.
Okay, model. If we're parking an onshore build as being a step too far.
I agree with you. I don't know of anyone that's actually suggesting that that was the proposition, but the submissions this committee has received, I'm asking you to comment on the submissions this committee has received, that at least two separate submissions from builders are saying that we have the capability in Australia to build these vessels. Do you dispute that?
We depending on the degree of Australian content and which elements of the content, we would have a capacity or potential capacity to build them. Okay,
so that doesn't seem to me to be in dispute but there is a question about the level of content, which is a matter of the procurement process, and the time issue.
Correct.
Is that, I just want to hone down the argument.
And cost.
Well, cost is always a part of the factor, but the question that's been, or the argument's been that we didn't have the capability.
No, I don't know that I have ever said that.
You haven't said it, but others have.
Well, if you want to, it's whether it's there will be. I can come back to workforce.
We can argue the toss about the nature of the capability. I just want to get that. I want to see whether we rule in or rule out capability.
Fundamentally, we could have the capability to build it. Yes, a hybrid build.
Thank you. Then there is an issue about time.
Correct.
And you're saying we didn't have enough time to build the vessel here on a hybrid basis.
Time and cost. Yep.
Cost. Well, you won't know about the costs because there was no tender.
Yes, I do, for a number of reasons. First of all, I'm regularly chastised by members of Parliament, public and journos for how come my project's late when I've relied on industry giving me time and cost over and over again. And over again, I rarely hear that industry's been criticised for that misjudgment, it's me. So we have learned to modify, if you like, industry claims about what they can do.
Okay. I don't think I've ever said that to you.
No, you haven't.
No. In fact, I've read your notes about how the procurement process has improved dramatically in this country.
Sure.
Right? Contrary to what is publicly asserted.
Sure.
But the level of our procurement capability has improved dramatically.
Sure.
What I'm critical of is that this went to a select tender under this arrangement under the US Free Trade Agreement, which I always understood was actually there to protect our options in regard to purchase of Australian goods. For instance, the Slouch Hat. We used the Slouch. We had a limited tender for the Slouch Hat, did we not?
Senator, I had to make an executive exemption under the rules, under the historic and iconic.
That's right.
Yeah.
Under this provision.
Yes, and if I can just make the point, we are using the same one to pursue the future frigate program.
But this is because, but that's exactly right. But it was actually there to secure opportunities for Australian industry, not take them away.
Well, it's there to make sure that we can provide essential defence equipment. That's what it's there for.
But it's also there to allow for Australian firms to have the opportunity.
It can mean that on occasions, yes.
Yeah. But the process that the government has opted here, on your recommendation, it would seem, and we don't know who else, but clearly on your recommendation, was to actually go to a Spanish or a Korean firm.
Yes. As the prime, but it does not exclude Australian participation. Right.
Well, I'll come back to that in 1 minute because I think that's a very important observation to make. Now, the issue of time, why wouldn't have that been satisfied by you, by the Commonwealth of Australia securing the services of another vessel as has occurred in the past when our supply vessels needed to be refitted?
Well, you mean such as Cantabria?
Yeah.
Well, they're used by their navies at that level. Now, that was a very, one-off special arrangement. Ultimately, we've got to get these replacement vessels.
Of course we do. I'm going to the issue of time. Did you consider the option of securing a vessel on a temporary basis while the acquisitions were?
Yes, there were, and as was second-hand vessels were considered.
And what was your?
Well, it wasn't done. That is obviously a capability matter. I'm looked at. I do the procurement, and it was determined that was not feasible.
I see. So between the 1st of April, when this decision was requested of the Finance Department?
No. Look, with Inside Defence, we have been working on this problem for not just 1st of April. I mean, this is a matter that we've been pursuing for, as you say, several years, working through options.
So the urgency issue takes on a new light if you've been working on it for years.
Well, we cannot commence a real procurement, that is, approaching the market, until we have first pass. So whichever government is, until the government of the day gives me first pass approval, I can only do market awareness.
Can you just explain the first pass approval process just very quickly? Some of us here are
sure.
So we can. On top of it as
we have a plan called Defence Capability Plan, which foreshadows defence procurements over a 10-year period and the sort of timeframes and type of values. We have limited, and I'm talking we now, whole of defence, not just DMO. We have a capability development group that produces that plan from all the needs and demands of the services. That's balanced against budget availability. They are then prioritised. We can spend a limited amount of money in the lead up to first pass doing what I would call market research, understanding what's available, understanding the market. But genuine approaches to market, that is, approaches that may lead to the award of a contract or future work, cannot be pursued until we have first pass approval by and large. Sometimes it's an interim approval, but effectively it's got to go to NSC, and NSC has to say, yes, you can proceed with that procurement. Now, between first pass and second pass is when we learn more information, and it's that second pass when the government approves the actual procurement and the signing of the contracts.
Mr King, the committee's been advised that BAE submitted an unsolicited proposal to government in September 2012 setting out a hybrid build program for the supply vessels, similar to the LHD program. Are you familiar with that?
Yes. I think it's one. I'm not sure of the dates, but
Okay, but you would acknowledge that the claim made by BAE in their submission is correct?
I'm not sure of the dates, but I certainly am aware of a submission, unsolicited proposal from BAE for a hybrid build.
They say that the additional time required to produce the replenishment ships according to the proposed hybrid model would be 6 months,
Yeah.
not the number of years that you're stating.
Well, Senator, can I just look? I hate to do this,
I can tell something.
but an LHD that was supposed to be delivered to me months ago is still late. Late by 7 months. And they had all the time that they wanted to build that ship. I have to make judgments over the top of a commercial proposal. Can I just give you some examples? On the LHD, there was 30,000 man-hours of work left over that the Navantia didn't do. It cost 70,000 hours in Australia. And for someone to propose, you know, I've got to put a degree of credibility. For someone to propose that a hybrid build would add only 6 months is not credible. Every piece of experience I have, I spend most of my time, as I said, not from you, Senator, I accept that, just trying to explain to the public why the AWD is late, why the LHD is now 7 months late. And it's not because, it's because we get more ambitious than we're able to deliver.
So
and what I'd like to see is an industry that can deliver.
It's quite preposterous. Given your commercial experience, to make an assertion.
It's not credible that it would only be 6 months. And that's the same based on LHD. Now, we're going to get into quite difficult commercial sensitivities here, Senator. But let me give you let me highlight that I have subsequently had other unsolicited offers for offshore builds, which give me different numbers.
So, Mr King, the question the committee's got to resolve is whether or not the right judgment call was made by not offering Australian industry the opportunity.
I make the point that they will be offered opportunities via the Prime.
All right, well, can you perhaps explain what you have in mind in that regard?
Well, in that regard, I don't expect it to be 40%. Can I just say on that LHD unsolicited offer, to get an Australian content of 40% was going to cost 40% more. And that's not my data. So we get exactly the same ship at 40% higher cost.
Is that based on their proposal or based on?
Based on two unsolicited proposals, and I will caveat, I don't put a lot of confidence in any unsolicited proposals.
But that's why we have tenders.
That's why we have tenders. Even they typically tend to be wrong, at least in schedule. The point I've made, Chair, on many occasions is, and I thank the Senator for his comments about defence procurement. Actually, over the last, since 2000, our defence procurement has run 7% under budget. So typically we get budget right.
Yep.
Our schedule performance is about 35% later than we advertised.
Yep.
It is getting better, but if I relied on unsolicited information, I can assure you we'd be getting worse again. So you're right, we do go to tender. Even then, though, we still make judgments.
Well, Mr King, can you enlarge on what advice you've just provided in terms of the opportunities for Australian industry participation in these?
Yes, certainly, Senator. I don't expect it'll be as significant as on the LHDs. In other words, on the LHD, what we did is the command and control, what we did in Australia, sorry, those two island modules, I think if you remember that, and command and control and communications were essentially the Australian elements. What we anticipate in the AOR case will be the command and control and the communication elements. But we will ask them to maximise the Australian industry content. Now, of course, beyond construction, there'll be the support of the vessels through life.
Senator Xenophon, do you want to jump in?
King, could I just You said that you'll be asking to maximise Australian industry content, is that right? Does that mean that it will be, in effect, a hybrid build?
Well, to me, Senator Xenophon, I think hybrid implies more build than just maximising Australian content. I mean, I don't want to dance around the facts here, but the hybrid build on the LHD was quite specific. It was 2 major items of physical construction on the island and these electronics and so on. I'm not certain that it would lead to a physical construction work for an Australian content.
So where will the physical construction work occur under the proposal that you're outlining today?
Spain or Korea.
So what, Australian industry would go to Spain or Korea?
No, sorry, that's physical. Oh, sorry, I meant by physical welding, module construction, electronics, C4I, the command and control system. We would anticipate that will come from Australia.
So it would be fitted out in Australia?
We don't have the details of that yet, Senator. Whether
That's your
whether it's better to be fitted out there or to... It's most likely, one would imagine from history, the ship would be brought to Australia and final fit outing here, but cable laying done in the overseas yard.
Are you able to say in broad terms, I know it's early days, what would that involve in terms of the total value of the project, in terms of the value being carried out here in Australia?
I don't know, Senator.
Could you
It'll be under 40%.
Be under 40%, and could it be as low as 10%?
Possibly, but I don't know. But can I just...
See, possibly below 10%?
Possibly, but I just genuinely don't know.
Right.
Can I tell you a bit of a problem with Australian content? It's usually related to Australian dollars. You can generate Australian content for no real productivity or employment effect. I'll give you an example. I'll make it up if I can. I'll try it because it's still commercially sensitive. If you buy a big ship from offshore and you do, let's say, 10% genuine Australian work, okay? I can turn that into 20% very easily, but it gives nothing to the value for Australia. And this is how I do it. If I contract for that ship from the prime contractor who builds the ship, he charges his normal markup, so let's say it's $1 billion worth of ship, and he adds $100 million worth of Australian stuff. If he's and that 100 million has, you know, Australian workforce, Australian profit, everything else. He now charges me his profit on the billion and say another 8% on the 100 million. So I get hit for another 8 million. If I contract via the Australian company, I actually get the profit on the 100 million that we would have got. But then that company, because they have to pass it through their books, will charge me their profit on that $1 billion, say 80 million or $100. So now I'm paying, or we are, Australia's paying, taxpayers are paying, 100 or, you know, in that example, 80 or $100 million purely to have it contracted via an Australian company, which adds nothing to Australian skills or talent, nothing to our ability to build future ships, and nothing to the workforce.
It avoids the so-called valley of death, though, doesn't it?
No.
You don't?
I'm happy to come back to the valley of death. Can I just make the point, on the LHD, we produced 4 modules. On the AWD, 31 modules per ship. I think 1 or 2 went offshore. So let's say roughly 30 modules per ship, 90 modules to be produced in Australia. It's chalk and cheese in terms of the amount of real shipbuilding. The other thing I'd make the difference between building an AOR and an air warfare destroyer or a frigate. They are, although they're smaller ships, they are very, very complex, and they bring into play all the skills that you need in a complex industry. They bring into play engineering, communications, combat systems, radars. So what you find is, on an air warfare destroyer, for example, can be more than half of the value is in actually electronics and engineering and project management and all those really skilled things. So if you really want a balanced, skilled industry, frigates, surface combatants, is where you bring in all the skills and the continuity. Now, just to compare the two ships we're talking about, if you go to a Korean yard, who are the specialists in tankers, and maybe I'll put this in context for you. In Korea, in one yard alone, they're delivering a ship every 9 days.
Are these naval ships?
No, they're tankers, but remember an AOR is very much like a tanker. Norway, and I can give you a really good example. Norway, who is a specialist shipbuilder, a renowned shipbuilder, who produces offshore vessels, all the time. The world's leading, probably world's leading, or certainly up there, offshore vessel builder, is buying its AOR from Korea. So there's a country with a well-established, renowned capability in shipbuilding has chosen to buy its AOR from Korea.
Can we just go back a step? And I noted, your palpable concerns about Australian industry. You said that I'm regularly chastised for being over time or over budget, when I think, I don't want to misquote you, when it's effectively you saw it as an industry problem, that you cop it in the neck for matters that you consider that are beyond your control. Is that a fair summary?
No, we play a role, and all I'm saying is that if I were to respond exactly to what every tender comes in, or certainly unsolicited proposals, and believed entirely what was in there without tuning it with experience, then I'd be very...
Does that mean you don't? Does that mean you take some of those proposals with a grain of salt?
No.
Does that mean you don't have as much trust as you'd like to with respect to Australian industry?
No, but I spent 20 years. I spent 20 years in the Navy, 20 years in industry, and 10 years in government. And I helped build up 2 companies in this country, from about 16 people to over 300 in one case and over 1,000 in another. One was an SME and one was a multinational. And I do know what happens in companies, and I do know what happens in people. We do get optimistic about what we want to try and do, and ambitious, and that's a good thing. But there's a palpable example right now. I stood up the Air Warfare Destroyer project. I went around this country on a roadshow between first and second pass saying to Australia that I wanted to be responsible for building 3 air warfare destroyers, and I wanted to be responsible for leaving Australia wanting to do more. That was my mantra. And I've been around shipbuilding and other bits of defence now a long time. Can I just finish that off, please, Senator? We thought of everything we thought we could think about to start up that air warfare destroyer. We looked at the drawing packs, we looked at the time, we developed a schedule. We created a longer schedule than has ever been developed for any comparable ship in the world in order to give Australian industry an opportunity to get on top of it and get it right. And guess what? Despite all that best efforts, despite being, as I thought, as practical as I could be, despite industry doing as much work as we thought we could to understand that problem, we spent $255 million between first and second pass looking at every practical thing we can. We did make one good decision. We didn't do a new design. That was a good decision. But even when we came to build an existing design, we're still having budget problems and we're still having schedule slip. So it's not just, do I treat them lightly? No, but I know you've got to temper marketing, ambition, with experience and the reality of what we face.
One of the frustrating, or from my point of view, and perhaps for some of my colleagues, is that the Winter report, Professor Don Winter's report in respect of shipbuilding is something that is a document that has been available to us, notwithstanding some orders for production of documents in the Senate. Presumably that the Winter report is a report that you've seen.
Yes, sir.
And presumably people, senior officers within finance would have seen that report?
Yes, I believe they have.
Right. And there would be, how many copies of that report have, would it be about a dozen people would have seen it in your view?
Look, I don't know, but that could be, I don't know.
Right. Because this comment, would you agree with this comment in respect to the winter report? The main problems with the project AWD as we have inherited is that there were problems with the initial program plan, there were problems with inadequate government oversight, there were problems with the alliance structure which seemed incapable to manage issues if and as they arose, and there were also problems with performance and capabilities of ASC and major subcontractors. Is that a reasonable statement in your view?
Well, it's their view. I hold differences with
No,
some
no,
of it.
that's the view of the Minister for Finance.
Well, I have a variation on some aspects, but yes, it's a reasonable summary.
Right. Senator Xenophon will put on the record that we did ask for the winter report to be tabled for this hearing, and we're still eagerly awaiting the Minister's response. So I'm sure the Minister's office can run down a copy for us now.
I'm happy to explain the AWD to you, Senator, if you want.
No, I guess the issue of this preliminary inquiry as part of the broader inquiry into naval shipbuilding is that Australian companies have been excluded from the tender process. I know that's a fairly blunt, maybe simplistic way of assessing it.
No,
but there doesn't appear, in terms of the issue of urgency, which is one of the reasons given, that's one of the reasons that you've given in respect of the supply ships being built overseas.
That's right.
It's not as though the success, in particular the success in the Sirius, we knew that they were going to require replacement a number of years ago, didn't we?
Yes, Senator.
So is the urgency due, for whatever reason, due to a lack of planning on the part of the DMO or Defence or some other factor? Can you assist us with that?
Well, Senator, no, I don't think it's a lack of planning. What it is a reflection of balancing out the complete suite of Defence's need against the budget and when you can afford to embark on programs.
But we still need to spend the money building these two supply ships.
Sometimes we've gapped capabilities because we haven't had the money, Senator.
Right. And we haven't had the money, so it's a gap capability issue in your view?
Well, look, it's getting well beyond my spectrum of business. My business is to pursue governments, acquiring products and so on. It's really in terms of how does the whole capability planning, where is the money spent and when, that's really better handled by Defence broader. But the fact is, there is a reality. Countries have money, Defence has needs, and they have to be balanced off.
I just want to ask, just further to that, I understand your frustration for being the fall guys, not the right word, but for bearing the brunt of criticism when you say that there are a number of other factors if a project is over time or over budget. In terms of the ANAO's report into the into the AWD program, do you broadly agree, accept the recommendations and the criticisms of the Audit Office of the Auditor General in respect to this program?
Broadly, but there was a number of matters on which I disagreed, and I have reason for that, and I'm happy to walk through those with you.
Would you mind providing, I'm just worried about time constraints, would you mind providing details what part of the Auditor General's report you say that you disagree with? Because, for instance, as I understand it, for instance, at paragraph 27, it says a better understanding of these risks, that is the first time the Navantia exported one of its ships designs for construction by international safeguards, that the Auditor General's office said that there should have been a better understanding of these risks. It's likely to have led Defence and the industry participants to proceed more cautiously in accepting the detailed design and moving into production.
So, yes, I can, but it's in the back of it. But can I just say something? This is a fascinating position we find in. So there was a design that had been built 4.5 times at the time that I thought we had given it all the thought we could give it reasonably to embark on the project. But we're sitting here today saying that possibly a ship, and we're going to build 3 of them, possibly a ship, 20,000 tonnes, never built offshore before, and suddenly, magically, this time, we can transfer all that design work to Australia, or even some of that design work to Australia, and there won't be a problem. There will be serious problems. Can I just show you one thing, Senator?
But there was no CAD technology provided in the Navantia in the AWD.
No, but CAD-CAM is not the saviour. The UK tried that on the Type 45. CAD-CAM was going to be the saviour for it, and it's not. Learning curve effect.
Well, they didn't have the opportunity of having CAD, did they? Or CAM?
Who?
in terms of the local builders
Well,
here?
there was CAD. It
from
wasn't
the
totally
venture.
integrated. Yeah.
It wasn't. Okay.
But the same thing will apply. If we were to build this AOR in Australia, exactly the same problems would apply. This is my presentation of learning curve effect. This is there's a thing called compensation. It's important if you're going to go, because this is perhaps helpful as you do the rest of your work. When you want to compare shipbuilding productivity, use a thing called compensated gross tonnes. What a compensated gross tonne is, it's an ability to compare the amount of labour hours per tonne of anything from a submarine through to a supertanker. Clearly, a supertanker in some ways is easier to build if you've got the facilities, because whilst it's very, very large, each individual element is not necessarily so complex. So if you look at compensated gross, I hope that explains, it's a way of comparing the labour hours per tonne of any ship you're building. When we bid the AWD, 4 million man hours for the ship would have been a reasonable allowance for a ship. And then the learning curve coming down as you build each ship. What we allowed in the AWD initial estimate was another 500,000 man hours to allow for the fact that there was other allowances as well starting up the facility. I'm just talking about straight productivity here. If you combine all the things that the ANAO said might have contributed to start-up inefficiency, and I accept the basic premise, by the way, that the gap between the completion of the ANZAC project and the start of the AWD project was a very much greater inefficiency than I thought. The workforce at BAE in Williamstown, for example, had lost most of its management skills of shipbuilding by the time we started AWD.
Which strengthens the argument for a continuity.
Absolutely. I'm absolutely convinced.
Why would we be losing that by having these supply ships being built?
Because they're not a continuity. Continuity doesn't apply because you're welding a metre of weld. Continuity applies by building the same ship many times.
But if you lay off a significant proportion of your workforce because there isn't work, you'll lose continuity.
Well,
doesn't the workforce disappear?
There is a prospect with what the government's initial decision is, and I'll show you on this drawing, that we will have a continuous program. This, if I could just...
So you're saying it's a prospect, so it's...
Well, because they've authorised feasibility studies. I can't jump ahead of their decision, but at least we've got, in my opinion, we've got, for the first time since Federation, an opportunity for a truly strategic shipbuilding capability. I have another image here of all the ons and offs that we've done over the last 50 years. We've built ANZACs and we stopped. We built Success and stopped. We built 2 FFGs. You know, I mean, it's been on and off for 50 years.
But Mr. King, isn't that what you're saying is part of the problem?
Exactly what part of the problem. But building a remotely and totally different ship doesn't give you continuity. Where you get continuity is building the same type of module over and over again.
But having a workforce gives you continuity, doesn't it? I mean, if shipyards have to let
No,
people
not
go,
precisely. That's the problem.
don't people go into other industries? Like if I'm out...
This is the fundamental problem. You're not building a Holden Commodore every day of the week, are you?
That's the problem.
Sure, but you're still building a car. It's like
No, but it doesn't work that way. You can never be productive if you're just building. You're moving from maybe building a 160-tonne module to a 300-something tonne module. And you go into that compartment to weld something, and what you want to do is each time you put your workforce into that compartment to build it, they've done it before. And I can show you here. You see, again, we made that. If I take the blame for everything, and I say me, I mean all the things we should have thought about, whatever, we probably produce it up to about here, 5.5. We are currently running at 9.3 million man hours on the AWD. That's a ship, that's the first AWD. That's a ship that's
the first one, not the second or third.
Correct. So we're now projecting down to there for the second one, down to there for the third one. Now here's my point. Should the government decide to build the future frigates based on the air warfare destroyer hull, incorporating an Australian-made radar, which would be absolute fantastic radar. It is one of the world's best for value for money. No excuses. Then we potentially end up starting that program at this sort of learning efficiency because we're using exactly the same modules by and large. There'll be some changes to some of the super.
That's what he's doing. That's what he's doing. He's putting a pitch for the next fucking project.
So what the government has said, at the same time as it said it's not practical or not practical to do those AORs in Australia.
So who said that? The government said it or you said it?
Well, no, I'm using their words. I recommend...
No, you said the government said it's not
No,
practical.
well, sorry.
Sorry, I'm just trying to understand where we're at.
In the formulation of defence advice, my advice was that it should be a limited tender. Government agreed to that advice. That's how I best put it.
Did you have any... to the government. They may well have rejected that advice. Through the chair.
Well, of course, yes. But how would you, for example, just come back to... In the light of this sort of experience for a frigate, going and embarking on a ship that's 3 times the displacement, with facilities that we don't have, with, I'll come back to workforce in a moment, with a design that no one owns here, put together, and with, even on the unsolicited proposals, a 40% premium to get 40% of the work. So that's not, that's add on 40%.
That's a given, that 40%?
Well, that's from their unsolicited proposal. It could be more, in my opinion. But
Mr. King, it sounds like you're making and you've said it yourself, use your own words, you've made a judgment call using your understanding and experience of the industry.
And lots of data,
which
and schedule impact.
And I guess the point where I suppose I come up from a different perspective, and again, I appreciate I don't have the experience that you have in this sector, but isn't the point that why would you need to make a judgment call? You let the market.
Yeah.
I mean, you create the tender process, and everything you're saying could be the reason why you make a decision. And they may be, I don't know, others can assess them. But isn't that why you have an independent process? Yeah. So you don't have to make a judgment call? You actually have a process to do that for you? It seems like we're preempting that.
You just said the unsolicited proposal indicated a 40% premium.
Yes, and longer time.
So,
but we also made the point that we don't believe. The entire point is, and this is the bit that I can't. This is where I suppose the point is, putting aside your arguments as to why you are of the view that this should be done between these two companies. A Spanish company and a Korean company. The bit that, again, to take a step back, nothing you said kind of changes my view, which is that may be the decision you ultimately reach, but.
Sure.
Why? I mean, if for nothing else, then to at least put pressure on those companies.
That would
put
normally
in lower price and lower costs. I mean,
so
I'm just saying from a purely free market perspective, wouldn't we be better off having a more competitive environment with more people competing, if for no other reason than drive everyone's prices down? Effectively, you've given 2 companies and said they only have to compete with each other now.
Let me try that again then, because I obviously didn't make it clear enough for you. That would be fine if you had multiple suppliers with access to multiple designs that could make an offer. So I'll come back to our experience.
So there's only 2 designs in the world?
Yes, but those designs are built by shipyards that own the designs.
But there's only 2 in the world? There's only 2
suppliers. No, there's more.
If I want to build a supply ship, I have to pick between 2 in the world.
No. So then I come back and say, all right.
Well, is it only 2 from your point of view in practical terms? Or
in practical terms, that will meet the defence's needs.
But if I went around to, and let's say, and you're more aware of this now, again, if I had an open tender, then surely there'd be excluding the Australian component, which we all have strong views on, there'd be, you're telling me there's, why would you exclude American firms? Why would you exclude, other European firms? Why would you exclude Asian firms apart from the Korean firm? What I don't understand is, from a basic perspective, is I understand you're saying there's a limited time period. You put that into the tender. You open it up. You let the tender process be at arm's length. And I just don't understand why we're making judgment calls when a tender process is designed so that we don't have to do this.
Well, we often do, because the defence market is so limited, and sometimes, in fact, we have to play in that market. For example, and we've played in that market to Australian industry's advantage. It would be possible, for example, there's big ticket stakes here, for major multinationals to structure what they're prepared to share intellectual property with, to actually moderate our market. If we didn't play actively and say, no, you won't do that, for example, that didn't apply in this case. Now, it's two things that industry require from me, I think, and that whether it's Australian or overseas, but particularly Australian, and I do have a great empathy with the Australian industry for defence. They require from me a reasonable prospect of winning and reasonable costs in tendering. Now, the unsolicited proposals, or a proposal alone, came back with a 40% increased cost and a later delivery for a hybrid build alone. And that's, and let me put it in degrees. An unsolicited proposal is about your lowest degree of certainty about the offer, right? It's somewhere between marketing and a tender, but it's certainly not tender quality. And always invariably, between the unsolicited proposal and the tender, things get worse, whatever that is. Schedule, price, whatever. Now, what prospect would have industry, against having to balance our budget against what advantage is it for the shipbuilding industry to do hybrid? Remember, 2 modules were produced. Even their submission, I think, was, I can't remember the number of modules, but it's not the whole ship, and not anywhere near the whole ship. What prospect of success would an Australian company have in an open tender, even had they secured those design rights? The second thing was, I'd have to be legitimate, to really give them a chance to bid. It sort of goes this way. We'd have to add a year for a hybrid build to the tender process and probably another year for an onshore build. So you're going to extend the tender period. You're then going to probably, in experience, extend the contract period, and then you're going to extend the build period. Now, when we extend the build, so if we did that hybrid, somehow they're going to have to get access to a design that's competitive. Secondly, we're going to take longer to get to tender, longer to get to contract, and longer to do the job. And in addition to those costs, I'm going to have the additional costs of keeping success at sea in somewhere between $20 and $50 million a year for every year it continues on. I don't know that I can satisfy value. I can't be honest to industry, and I can't satisfy government's reasonable expectation and taxpayers' reasonable expectation of value for money. I'd be misleading industry to say they stand much prospect.
So Senator Edwards has been very patient. So Senator Edwards, you've got some questions?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. King. And I just pick up one of the questions and follow on that Senator Xenophon raised was, you know, this lack of planning. Now there's some urgency in doing this. In fact, the AOR replacement is a program which has been on the table for quite some time, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. And
would from 2009-10 to 2016-17, $16 billion was cut or deferred from the defence budget, including $9.2 billion from the Defence Capability Plan. Since 2009, has the deferment of this program been because of those cuts that were made to that program then?
Senator, I'm not certain. You would have, I mean, no doubt cuts defer programs, but in actual tracing that, it would have to be, I'd have to refer it to the Capability Development Group about how that actually impacted that project.
So it's actually, I mean, this has been an imperative for some time to get these supply ships replaced, but in actual fact, since 2009, the budget has been going backwards in defence, and so therefore programming of shipbuilding has also become. Well, you just haven't been in a position to let any tenders.
Well, Senator, there has been budget pressure, but we have let tenders, so, to be clear...
But you've had to reprioritise.
Yes, indeed. Defence has had to reprioritise, yes.
Yeah, and this has been given the bum's rush, to use an Australian colloquialism, up until now, where would it be fair to say that the current government has reactioned it and reprioritised this program?
I'm certainly able to say the government has prioritised this program, yes.
And said it cannot be deferred any longer because it is probably hasn't been given the attention that it warranted over many years until now?
Well, Senator, you'd know that that's a difficult place for me to be.
Well, you talked about economics, the bathtub effect. It now becomes an imperative to replace those because of the bathtub effect is having a far greater budgetary implication now because they are beyond their use-by date.
Yes, if Success in particular, if it continues to operate beyond that, and it will have to, beyond the 217, every year will get more expensive and more difficult.
And you have, I mean, you know your business, and I take your point about your experience and your capacity, and I have a great deal of respect for it because you bring to this industry a level of probity which I think, would be lovely if it was across all departments and with no different criticism, but it's a skill that you bring. I just take you to a submission made by Defence SA, which is my home state, which is obviously very sensitive to any movements here. And I just want to probe, if I can, a number of assertions they have made. Are you aware of their two-page submission?
Yes, Senator, I think I did read it on Friday.
Okay, just let me just go over. The Defence Minister, and I'm just quoting from the document here, the Minister of Defence stated that the ships are far too large for us to build in Australia, either the 20,000-tonne Navantia design or the 26,000-tonne Daewoo design, without, quoting the Minister, a lot more millions and potentially billions in infrastructure investment. Mr Fletcher's contention, because he'll be a witness later today, these comments do not accurately reflect existing shipbuilding facility capacity in Australia. And then they go on to say, Defence SA, based on available design information, investment of around $20 million would increase the capacity of the ship lift to support vessels up to 15,500 tonnes, and that's up to 2,000 tonnes. And it goes on, the contention is that and even if the ship lift needed to be extended by length, it could be achieved for around 50 million. And a 15-metre extension would increase lift capacity to 17,000 tonnes. And then there's some discussion about what actual shipbuilding is required, because you're talking about laden weights and they're talking about dry weights and things like that. And in fact, there would be a very small investment in the context of a $1.8 billion supply ship project. What do you say to those comments?
Well, first of all, I've worked very effectively with the South Australian Government and Defence SA. I hold them in high regard. When we embarked on the AWD program, they made a compelling offer. It was part of, you might remember back then it was a competition between effectively a Victorian build and a South Australian build. They did a terrific job in establishing that precinct, Techport, and the facilities for surface combatant building at ASC is excellent, and that's combined with the South Australian Government common user facility. I'd like to come back to that chart because that's my point. It's ideally suited for that. However, it's not simply a matter of building a synchro lift large enough, able to take the displacement. That's actually only a necessary precursor to be able to build and launch. The point I made earlier is your total infrastructure environment, including all the shedding, paint and blast, craneage, all has to be upgraded to take these much, much larger modules that would exist on the AOR. Secondly, should the current government or a future government go down the path of building future frigates based on the air warfare destroyer, you'd really have quite a conflict, because the last thing we would want, in my opinion, is to have one or two one-off very large ships not completely, but significantly diverting and diminishing the ability of us to become a world-leading surface combatant builder. And you wouldn't be talking about subsidies or anything. If we do it well and structure well, we'd actually be building them in this country at the same price that we could buy them anywhere else. It would be a legitimate business with a real strategic value that needs no additional budget investment to do it. So I would not like to see investment in one or two ships or investment in infrastructure, which we'll never use again in the foreseeable future, 30 years, compared to that attention and investment of any amount in trying to become a really good surface combatant builder.
An export market?
Hard to say, Senator, but if Australia can reach world benchmarks, and we've seen that they have, ANZAC proved that, then surface combatant, I'll just be careful, not submarine, surface combatant, yes, it is possible. Because if you look at the labour rates, say, in countries that we'd be competing against, and it's, pretty obvious, UK, America, labour rates are not really the issue. And I've got a lot of productive data. If you look at the actual cost of the production of a metre of welding, we're quite okay. It's about being organised. For example, I was talking to a person I know in the US shipbuilding industry. When they start a job, they want to be in the order of 96 or 97% material availability. In other words, when that tradesman goes down to do something on that compartment today, everything's there. The rods and machinery, the fittings, the brackets, the drawings. We have dropped as low as 68%, I think. And what's the reason? Well, it's being organised. It's doing the same job multiple times. It's learning from the first job. It's taking that and feeding it back into your supervisors. The supervisor level, management level is very, very critical in this business. Very, very critical. Electricians and welders and boilermakers, you prefer them to be from the industry, but they can come from outside and can go back out. But that's how to supervise the job, how to manage it, how to get the tools available, how to sequence it. All of that is the skills that come from having a business that you do the same style of business over and over again.
And you don't see the supply ships as being of the same style as surface combatants?
No.
So that's why you think we're wasting our time to go down that path?
So you're talking about building a truck or a road train as compared to a mini miner? Well, or a fleet-footed or a Ferrari. See,
I've spent so long in shipbuilding, it's like comparing a surface combatant with an AOR. But no, but I mean, I was trying to sort of. I had a picture. I don't think I've got here. The modules, you imagine, 300 and 600 ton modules are just massive.
And on that note, Mr. Giga, the images that you've kind of very kindly.
I'll table.
If you can table them all at in a
form we can use.
In a form we can use.
Electronically,
it's just that I couldn't hop around, but I've got hard copies here I can pass around as well.
Can I follow up?
You see if
it's on the same thing.
Yeah, if it's on the same.
If you can imagine that module there, that top one is, sorry, pass them all. I'll keep one. This top module is a module out of, sorry, which one is that? That's out of the AOR, one of the competitors.
Which competitor is that?
That's Cantabria.
But they're not part of the tender process, are they?
Yeah.
I thought it was...
Well, I'm just giving you the two ships that are, and subject to tender, have modules of this sort of size.
Oh, so the more, okay, yeah.
And that one down the bottom is, I think that's a
Senator
900
Carr?
tonne
Look,
module.
time's, we obviously need to get you back, Mr King, because this inquiry will go further than this matter. I'd be interested on notice, if you can't provide it today. You indicated that in terms of your decision-making process, within DMO, the DMO recommendation was based on consideration of capability, and we've discussed that, and time. And in that process, you indicated that you had considered a purchase, second-hand purchase, and/or a lease. Can you give the committee any advice, copies of reports on the evaluations of those two options?
Senator, just to be clear, I said Defence had considered.
I see.
I didn't.
Are you able to provide us with advice?
I would certainly take that on notice, Senator.
Thank you.
Can I just add to the AOR one, cost?
But I'm talking capability fits within the broader...
Yeah.
I mean, I've got a number of subheadings under that issue, but I'm just saying the question of capabilities and also, I mean, I just make the observation to you that unsolicited tender is of a limited value, but it does indicate an intention, an interest, and those other issues of costs and time are matters for negotiation in the process. That aside, on my second question goes to the issue of Australian industry participation under the new contract arrangements, and I'd like further detail on what you're proposing on that. Mm-hmm. And given that you've said that it's one of the difficulties in going to an open tender is the arrangements, licensing arrangement with the designers, why would that be different in terms of your proposal for industry participation under these new arrangements?
Well, it's different because they are shipyards, and now they're seeking to discriminate on improving their offer.
Would you include that in your tender specifications?
Well, we will be including it. We haven't put the tender out yet.
Yes, but it will have a specific requirement for Australian industry participation.
It'll have a specific requirement for Australian industry, what's it called? Capability plan, yes.
Okay, and I'll just go back to the other submission, to the submission by Defence SA. They talk about docking capacity, and if there was an investment made into Techport down there, that this would provide a very viable alternative in the future for docking of these supply ships or larger size vessels, because the only one now effectively in Australia is Garden Islands Captain Cook graving dock. So is there any merit in that argument of upgrading Techport in South Australia for an alternative docking region, or are we geographically in the wrong location for this type of activity? We're hardly going to face a threat from Antarctica.
I think it requires a bit of dredging work as well, and access is a bit difficult. But we're currently, obviously, in the Force Structure Review white paper process, and these matters will also be reconsidered again then, strategic needs. But on balance, certainly at the moment, we have enough of that strategic capability, you know, relative to our needs. But I think the whole industrial capacity issue will be re-evaluated in the white paper and the outcomes from that, including the Defence Industry Policy Statement. So, I mean, that will all come out next year.
So then the contention that also that they could get this done in 6 months, given that there's probably 12 months of environmental approvals in a dredging program, at least, that they could become or have some capacity? Or does this go back or reflect on those comments that you made earlier about representations which are made, which you know intuitively through your own experience that are, you know, unlikely to be able to be delivered?
Well, interestingly, this one, Senator, the South Australian, well, construction facilities, including, say, the shipyard for AWD, and this is what we see commonly. We often think of them as being, as they call it, the long pole in the tent. In other words, we won't have the facilities ready in time because of the schedule that the shipbuilder proposes. It does normally turn out, in fact, because that takes longer than people think, that the facilities are ready in time. So it's possible that you could embark on this and have the facilities ready in time, but only because the other aspects of the program that were offered don't execute as quickly as people believe. So facilities usually doesn't turn out to be the problem.
Okay. Before I hand over to my colleague, the current air warship destroyer program that is running out of there, how far over budget is it?
Well, yeah, my colleague reminds me of my words I use all the time. Sorry, I need to answer your question because it's not just simple yes or no. When we put forward the proposal for the air warfare destroyer project to government for approval, it was operated under an alliance, and that still does under an alliance contract. And the reason for that was work done by Finance and Carnegie Wiley, resulting from the Collins-class submarine, that said it's unreasonable to put the full financial burden of a project on industry, and that an alliance project offered a prospect of a better risk sharing between government and industry. So when in the alliance, for every dollar the shipbuilding aspect is over budget, industry loses 50 cents of profit and defence pays 50 cents extra in. When we put that in for second pass approval, therefore, I put in contingency money against that outcome in the project. So the shipbuilding...
Was there any contingency by industry to put some contingency in their profit for that?
Well, they lose their profit, okay. So that's how... They had what was called management reserve.
Okay, same thing.
Same thing. Okay. But we saw all the management reserve.
Sure.
Now, what will current estimation, remember we haven't spent the money yet, so this is budgeting estimation. We haven't spent over the money yet.
So we're talking about the AWDs, I apologise.
Yes, it is, yeah. So there's really three elements to the project. I'll put aside missiles and all the other things we do. The three essential elements are the shipbuilding, the combat system integration, and the Aegis combat system from the US. So the Aegis combat system is on schedule and on budget, and that's over $1 billion. The other elements of the combat system and all its integration is on budget and on schedule. The shipbuilding aspect is over budget, and at the moment it's in the order of $360 million.
That's the element that we're talking about here today, isn't it?
Effectively,
it's the shipbuilding component.
That's right, because an AOR is mostly shipbuilding.
Yep.
So the shipbuilding aspect is over budget. Just for the record though, the project is under budget at the moment.
Mm-hmm. But
that gives no comfort to anybody that there's an element that is over budget.
Sure. So, and time-wise?
About 2 years at the moment.
2 years over budget, over
late.
time. 2 years late?
It varies. It's a bit different for each ship.
Okay. What percentage is the $360 million of the total shipbuilding budget?
It'd be of the order of 15%. 7.5%?
Sorry, 7.5%.
So we could get that for you, Senator.
And your 2 years, what are you out there from a time budgeted? Are you out 50%?
You mean could it be worse?
What are you projecting the finish date on that shipbuilding component? I understand the other two components.
I see, last ship. Well, the reason that this can work is because of the fact that AWD didn't deliver when we expected. So the last construction we think now on the AWD is sitting in the area of 2019, 2020. So it is possible, depending on this government and subsequent governments, that the future frigate, if it's authorised, based on the air warfare destroyer hull, could pick up and be the basis of a proper strategic shipbuilding industry.
Got it. Clear as crystal. I'm just wondering about our capacity to build supply ships in light of all this, the conversation. So if we take the imperatives for supply, to get rid of our old barges, our old AORs, and our shipbuilding component, these are the reasons why you're looking to place it into tender. Because they're already at capacity in Australia. Is that right?
Well, BAE is running. BAE is a module builder for AWD, and we're looking to reallocate some work for them, but they are under pressure. But broadly, my contention would be that against the opportunity to have a proper strategic shipbuilding plan, anything that jeopardised that, in addition to the fact that it would take longer, cost more, a lot more, is the reasoning behind not pursuing the onshore aspect of that.
Well, the unsolicited tender to you has already indicated that there'd be 40% above what you have been already indicated. Is that
That's
right?
right. I have to merge two unsolicited proposals to draw that conclusion, but that's a fact.
So given that there's so many millions at stake, and the Air Warship Destroyer program has drawn a lot of attention for it being, for the component of shipbuilding being 7.5% over budget or thereabouts, then it would be quite outrageous to even consider something that was 40% above. And I want shipbuilding in South Australia, but I actually don't want to send the taxpayers broke.
Well, that all factored in my recommendations, but where I am buoyant about this, where I'm really buoyant is, we have been on, look, I was involved in shipbuilding in the US when we bought the frigates. And at that stage, we hadn't built anything more than about a 2,500 tonne, 3,000 tonne destroyer escort for the last sort of decade. We were buying ships, FMS from America, from anywhere, and we were doing the odd ship in Australia very unsuccessfully in government-owned yards. We then privatised a yard in Williamstown, and it, through having a continuous build program, you could demonstrate that even with our labour rates and everything else, we could have a world competitive shipbuilding industry. If we go all over the shop, higgledy-piggledy, picking it because it's got the word ship in it, it's likely to be deleterious compared to focusing on what is a real strategic opportunity. This is quite phenomenal the way this has come together, that the frigate that Defence needs for the future, and I can't say that this is planned, although I did buy the rights to the hull,
Well done.
the IP rights to the hull, happens to be a hull about the same size as the AWD hull. So while that wasn't planned, it's a fantastic opportunity to actually take all that investment of the mistakes we made on the AWD, put in some Australian technology, the CEA radar, which is just world's first-class radar, potentially the Saab, South Australian Combat System, you know, could be another one, but that's one of the ones we'll be studying. Put it in a ship and build, you know, another 8 ships really efficiently, world's best practice.
Senator, would you mind if we...
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. King.
Conscious of the time. So I think there was Senator Katter.
Yeah, so just a couple of questions.
And then Madigan, yeah. And so if you don't mind, is it possible, there's only, I think, a little bit longer in questions, if we perhaps ran 10 minutes over time, 10, 15 minutes over time, rather than having to bring this back? Yep.
As I understand it, what you've said is that you're excluding the Australian companies from the tender process, but you've also, in questioning, said that the process that you wanted to go down involves some Australian content down the track. So, and it could be something up to 40% or
No,
down.
I didn't think it would be as high as that.
Well, it could be as low as 10% or nothing higher than 40%.
It could be, Senator. I can't imagine it'll be 40%, but I don't want to prejudge the solution, obviously, but I think it'll be less than that.
Okay, I'm trying to understand why have we gone down that track of having some Australian components in the process, but under the process you've chosen, but not allowing Australian companies to tender for it up front in terms of the two unsolicited offers that you've had. There were two involving the hybrid build and teaming up with the Spanish and the Korean firms. So those two companies were part of that unsolicited approach, but you've excluded that, and there was no mention of those particular unsolicited tenders by government, and there's some concern within the industry about why those haven't come to light. But we now have a process where you're saying that it's possibly some Australian content creeping in through the primes. So can you just explain why you've gone down that track?
Because sure. And I am on difficult ground here because we're now getting into commercially sensitive areas. I have more than the unsolicited proposal that you have.
Well, there's two.
Or you've been talked about.
There's two unsolicited.
Well, I think there's even more than that. And some of them come from companies that have also put in multiple, some teamed and some unteamed. And from that, not my information, even if I don't moderate it, the cost to get Australian content in the structural elements of the ship is totally disproportionate to the amount of benefit or work we would get out of it. So the bits that we have encouraged the tenderers, or we will encourage the tenderers to offer, are bits that are inserted in the structure. Command and control, which is combat management system, and communication systems, things like that. So they're not part of the structural elements of the ship. So the point I made earlier was that to do some of the structural work in Australia, to get it up to sort of 40%, and I did warn you've got to be careful about that 40%. A lot of that can be just pure profit, which doesn't do anything for our workforce or our workers. Came at 40% premium on top. So paying nearly 50% more for a ship to get 40% Australian content. That's not my proposal, that's unsolicited. And I'd have, my experience is, I think universally, that whatever's put in unsolicited proposals worsen when they become a tender, whether it's schedule, price, content. For example, in other areas, we've had the issue of companies saying they're going to have a certain content, and then we have to be very vigilant to make sure that actually when we sign the contracts, we get that content. We have to be very vigilant because sometimes that starts to get challenged. So the prospect out of the unsolicited proposals was longer to contract, longer to build, and far more expensive to acquire.
Can you just explain to me what impact, if there's no Australia involved in the structural side of things, how does that impact on the servicing and maintenance of those vessels down the track?
Look, I've heard that argument. It's not one I support. Let me give you a really simple example. F-111s were one of the most expensive exotic aircraft of their day. They were fully maintained by Australian industry right up to the finish and very effectively. Super Hornets, JSFs will all be built overseas, and I can assure you we'll support them very effectively in Australia. What is important is that you have their IP in order to be an intellectual property, in order to be able to make changes and modify them through life. That's very important. We've got, well, 6 FFGs. The first 4 of those, were just bought straight from America. We've had ships from overseas all of our life and we've supported them. I don't actually contend that you can only maintain them if you've built them, but I do contend, just to be clear, that we should have a shipbuilding industry. I'm very much supportive of a surface combatant shipbuilding industry for all the reasons I've talked about today, but one in particular which goes beyond maintenance is ships are effectively handmade. You need lots of workers. You need, as I spoke about earlier, you need lots of competent supervisors and management levels. The world capacity that we can access to buy surface combatants is diminishing quickly. American shipyards, UK shipyards, European shipyards, surface combatants I'm talking about, diminishing quickly. Ships take 5-6 years to build. It strikes me as a good strategic insurance policy that we have the ability, should pressure grow, for us to need an expanded Navy, that we have a fundamental capacity to be able to build those ships. Because one thing we would know for sure, if there was suddenly a demand for another 20 or 30 surface combatants from our allies and friends and allies and the markets that we could go to, we wouldn't be seeing one for 8 or 10 years. So I believe the maintenance argument is not very sound, but I believe the argument to have a strategic capacity to do it is. And I think there's an ability to be able to do it at world's best practice and at the same price that we would pay from offshore if we can follow a good strategic solution.
But what's your response to the submission from the Defence Teaming Centre, where they're talking about breaking the paradigm of this production by production, a project by project approach, and going to this what they call the continuous build approach, and they advocate a warship and a submarine being constructed every 2 years?
Well, that's. I'm sorry if I hadn't made myself clear, but that's exactly what I'm saying on this chart. If this future frigate, and question mark when that starts, if this future frigate is based on the same hull as the air warfare destroyer, then we should start at this sort of level, or it's an estimate, I'm not, and we should be able to get to world best practice around about ships 3. And with Australian radars and Australian technology in it. I've never seen a better opportunity for us to have a real strategic capability that's cost efficient, that no one has to apologise for, and for which is value for the taxpayer.
Senator Madigan.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. King, earlier when we were speaking about the AWD, you said that the project was 360 million over budget. That's the shipbuilding project part of the job. Now the hull, correct me if I'm wrong, the hull was brought in from overseas to be fitted out the top, the module. Sorry?
All built here.
Sorry?
All built here.
All built here, all right. Now, when we're comparing that to the hulls that have been brought in from overseas to be fitted out here, I believe I've been told, correct me if I'm wrong, that things have turned up from overseas late. They haven't been completed up to that point to where we expected them to be when they arrived here, and that there were rework that had to be done on these components that were brought in. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so I just want to be clear. So, because there's a lot of talk about, as you say, being over budget, but just so we're clear, how much of that being over budget is attributable to, one, the fact that they arrived late, two, the fact that they weren't
No, and you've mixed up two projects entirely.
But I'm saying, but all these things contribute
Yeah, but
to, in the public domain, when we're talking about Australian shipbuilding,
Yep.
how much of that is taken into account? That, you know, what we've inherited, our shipyards have inherited when these projects have turned up here, the components from overseas with rework being delivered.
Can I just clarify that, because it's wrong. Your assessment of the situation is just totally wrong. The only project we have, which is effectively totally Australian, is the one that's late and over budget.
So it's only that one?
Yep. In the main.
So?
In the main.
Yep, right.
The LHD, the big ship,
Yep.
the bulk of that ship was built in Spain.
Right.
It would no doubt have come with some deficiencies. I mean, we are talking about a thing with hospitals, you know, hundreds of compartments. I have no doubt that there would be some deficiencies in that. I can't remember the number of days late it was delivered. 66 days. By the way, that's totally an Australian company that contracted to have that done.
Yeah.
But to put that in context, in order, it goes like this. You know, there's a broad principle. If we buy offshore, it comes on time. If we do hybrid, it comes a bit late. And if we do totally onshore, it's late. That's the basic premise. And if we want to be serious about this, and if we want an effective shipbuilding industry, and I do, then we've got to stand up. It's not rocket science, but it is complex. Address the matters that aren't being addressed properly, get the continuity of shipbuilding underway, and have a real industry that's both effective and efficient and produces us the product that we want instead of looking for other reasons. And so it's just, you know, the same company, by the way, that was producing watercraft for us, came on time, came on budget, I think. I don't think there's any doubt about that. So we actually introduce complexity and pressure on schedule when we do hybrid builds or when we do Australian builds. When we do Australian builds, we challenge the biggest challenge. But I don't want to say that we shouldn't face that challenge. I simply say that we've got to be honest about what it is we've got to do it, and make sure the people of Australia are willing to pay, you know, what will by then stage be competitive world price to have a great product. But you don't get there by just trying to lay it off. You're in the big world, the big international world. You can't run away from it. Countries around the world can build these ships well. I mean, the experience I've had in a couple of Asian shipyards recently, they haven't missed a delivery for years. And they talk about 3 weeks as being, you know, a terrible error. We're talking about years.
I'm just very conscious of time. Do you mind if we go to Senator Xenophon?
I just want last.
Okay, final question from Senator Manning, then we'll go straight to Senator Xenophon. And then we've got one from...
So, Mr. King,
Senator
what you're saying is that if Australia dabbles in a little bit of this and a little bit of that, we're never going to be competitive. What you're saying is that if we specialise in one area of where we're committed to, that we can have a long-term viable competitive shipbuilding industry.
I believe so.
Right. And but you're further elaborating to that is you're saying that if we dabble in a little bit of this and a little, you know, we've got fingers in every pie and we're not specialising, well then everything's just going to fall over.
I believe so.
Okay, yep.
I believe so.
Yep.
That just confirms Senator Xenophon's question. You know, if like we keep building air warship destroyers and we build dozens and dozens of them, we get very good at it.
Yeah.
You know, it's very hard to...
I'm conscious of time, so you may want to take some notes, but there's preserving management skills is also important, isn't it?
Correct.
And the risk is that if there's going to be a gap between major projects, that we could lose those management skills.
Indeed.
Right. And that has to be what we need to be very careful of in terms of any future planning. And there's a risk of that happening without these supply ships.
Can you answer I know you're nodding and agreeing, but the hands
Yes,
up.
yes, that's correct. Your proposition is right. You need continuity of work, and in my opinion, the initial decision of the government to do the feasibility of reusing the air warfare destroyer hull with Australian radars and other equipment represents the best opportunity to deal with that matter. And if decisions are made, as it's proposed they will, we could very much be in that place where we keep that continuity of those skills.
Sure, and just very quickly, can you just clarify that before you made you gave your view, the opinion that there should be a restricted tender, had you had any discussions with anyone in government at a senior level about these matters?
Probably. I mean, I talk to ministers, but can I just say again, that recommendation was in the context of a package of decisions. The AOR, the future frigate and the Pacific patrol boat. So my recommendations were based on that package of work being considered and what was the best work to be allocated to Australia to ensure that continuity you're talking about, to ensure that we drive the industry to a really efficient base and that we have a real strategic capability.
And within that context, you would have had discussions with ministers in respect of that?
I suppose, yeah, Senator, I'm sure I have.
You may have answered a little bit in response to Senator Xenophon's question. I just wanted to clarify, you mentioned before about the Valley of Death, and you said you might come back and make some comments. Can you just clarify exactly what is now in train for Australia's shipbuilding industry in the next few years to fill in this valley, so to speak?
First of all, just for thinking forward, because I know you're going to be thinking for the future, the Valley of Death, which is a term I never liked, because it really came about from a decision much longer ago to do, but without thinking ahead, that we got into the need to replace LHD and AW, to get LHDs and replace AWs at the same time. So the peak workforce that we created by having those concurrencies in Australia was larger than we probably ever, this is guessing, larger than I'm aware of that we've ever seen in shipbuilding since the Second World War. So we created this peak for that period. There was always, in my opinion, going to be a reduction in workforce, not a valley of death, a reduction in workforce. Now what we have is the prospect of rebaselining the AWD and re-establishing it so we've got a deliverable 3 ships, feasibility study leading to, hopefully, if we can convince the government, that, and by that I mean industry and defence, that we can produce a viable surface combatant shipbuilding, so you've got that. And then the third element is the element of the Pacific patrol boat build for Australia. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. King, just in wrapping up, I just wanted to you've obviously spoken a fair bit about the frigates. No decision's been made on that, that's correct?
Well, a decision to spend 78 million for me and industry to go away and study putting, as I said, that Australian radar on that hull.
But I'm saying no decision.
Not a first part.
Because, I mean, I'll break it down. Part of what you've been saying today is that the view of DMO was that we shouldn't be building the supply ships here and we should have a limited tender for a whole host of reasons, in part because the industry here should be built towards being specialised in a certain area. Now, some of us will disagree and say always have a tender, open tender, and let the market sort that out, but putting that aside. But what would happen then to the industry if part of your decision seems to be predicated on a decision of government that hasn't been made? So what would happen then to the industry if the government decided not to build the frigates here and you've decided not to build the supply ships here?
Well, obviously, if you decide not to build the frigates here and no other ship,
Won't be any ships.
you won't be building ships in Australia. That's a fact. But can I just make the point again about the AOR? The AOR would not have whatever degree, apart from an onshore build, even that is questionable, but a hybrid build will not add much remember, the hybrid build is some module, some superstructure. It's not enough in its own right to establish or maintain a viable shipbuilding industry. You are building the decision, even if it was to build some modules, would be just simply that.
And I know we're going to cover this later as we get further into this inquiry, but the point you're making is that the very strong view of DMO to government has been that the frigates should be built here.
Indeed.
Okay, well on that, now I do want to again thank Mr King for the extended period of time and Mr Thorne, who I think got one word in, for the extended period of time they've made themselves and DMO available. I also do want to again stress on the record, Mr King, I did understand that you were actually, you cut your leave short to be able to be here and speak to us today, which is a brave move. So
From the doctor's rooms, really.
so thank you so much, Mr King, we really appreciate you making yourself up. Do we want to reconvene at, I think the schedule has us reconvening at 12:25, but perhaps we can, 1:25, sorry. Perhaps reconvene at 1:30? Okay, well why don't we, look, 35 minutes should be long enough. Why don't we reconvene at 1:25?